Isaac. So for those who are joining us over Zoom, you are getting a sneak peek of what happens behind those polished videos and how many takes it take to put them in a fancy way together. Okay, I will start now, Isaac. I'm waiting for his confirmation. Wonderful. Okay, our next take. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our final Women and Gender Studies Spotlight event for this academic year. The Women and Gender Studies Spotlight event is a monthly gathering where we highlight the work of our scholars, of activists, of artists, and our community leaders. We spotlight their work that is shaping our conversations, that is shaping conversations around gender, sexuality, race, power, and justice. As I always say, think of these conversations and think of this series as an invitation and a celebration. A celebration and an invitation to learn, to reflect, and to engage. For those of you who I haven't met yet, I am Nermeen Allam, and I direct the Women and Gender Studies program here at Rutgers, Newark. Today, we are honored to host Dr. Zahra Ali and to feature her phenomenal work. Dr. Zahra Ali, we are honored to have her affiliated with our program, the Women's and Gender Studies program. She is an associate professor of sociology, and she is the founder of Critical Studies of Iraq at Rutgers University here at Newark. She is an extraordinary scholar and an extraordinary colleague. Her work sits at the intersection of gender, politics, and society in the Middle East and North Africa. She examines how women navigate conflict, how they rebuild communities, and how they contest power in moments of upheaval and transformations. Dr. Zahra's work brings into focus the everyday practices through which women exercise agency after and often under conditions of constraint, conditions of violence, and conditions of political uncertainties. It is the kind of work that bridges gender, conflict, and the lived realities of political life. Her talk today is titled Uprising and the Apocalypse. It's always get me this word. From Iraq to Palestine, the talk invites us to reflect on how at moments like this, at moments marked by genocide and the normalization of fascist politics, how we have to be intentional, how at moments like this we have to be intentional about whose voice shape how we understand the world. The talk centers the lived experiences of knowledge, of those who are not just observing power, but are living its consequences. It turns to Iraq and its uprisings, while also reflecting on the ongoing Israeli war on Palestinians. It draws on transnational and decolonial feminist approaches to think through what this moment demands of us analytically and politically. Professor Ali will share with us her insight over the next 30 minutes or so. I will turn it now to Professor Ali. Again, it's a pleasure to welcome you in our series and very much to look forward to your talk and to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Nermeen. Thank you to the faculty and staff of the Women and Gender Studies program for inviting me to give this final lecture of the semester. We're all a little bit exhausted at the end of the semester, but I hope I can keep you with me throughout this lecture. I'm going to start with sharing my screen. Give me one sec. I think it's always better to have pictures and images. And leave the face kind of in the corner. Hopefully, I mainly use pictures. I don't use PowerPoint to show text. Um, so I'll start with saying that these are no ordinary times, right? A time of genocides and fascism, um, and really writing and speaking in the tone of academia feels superfluous, it feels dissonant, especially since the past 2 years and a half. Many of us actually have used the term genocide in relation to Gaza almost obsessively, while we actually know that what is happening there is actually beyond words. Israel is continuing its genocide in Gaza and in Lebanon, and the US and Israel's war on Iran is likely to start again. Connected to these dynamics involving regional fascist forces in the region, Gulf countries, the UAE in particular, genocidal violence is also committed in Sudan. There is something to say about both silencing and silence, between the silencing we are facing when we critique Zionism, right, and the astonishing silence on Sudan. In the face of apocalyptic destruction and violence, I often ask myself, what are words after all? Just sounds, fragments of our feelings, of our limitations. There is also the shame of writing and speaking as the spectator of incommensurable violence. About Gaza and beyond, a shame better captured by poets such as Sadiq al-Radi writing from and about Sudan. أخجل أن أكتب حرفا الدم بعد لم يجف يخجل الحرف. The translation from Briyar Bajalan goes, I'm ashamed to write a single letter. The blood has not yet dried. The letter is ashamed. As I often say it, I know as a feminist that feelings are a form of knowledge, that knowing is a feeling. And this feeling, this reaction, for me has not been coming out of nowhere. It has been the result of having spent my entire adult life organizing, researching, writing, thinking in, from, and about Iraq, about the impact of the US-led invasion and occupation on Iraq and on Iraqis, about feminist and social movements in Iraq. As a feminist, as a sociologist, as the daughter of Iraqi refugees who has lived in Iraq during the sectarian war that followed the US invasion and occupation. All this work, this 2 decades of work, sometimes makes me wonder, where did all these words go, right? 23 years into the war on terror, 4.5 million people killed and maimed, 38 million people displaced in the entire region. And yet, Americans still say 9/11 never forget. In the past 2 decades, none of the architects of this incommensurable devastation and suffering, no one was ever taken in front of a court. Most of the people who are directly responsible for the apocalypse in Iraq are living comfortable lives. In the age of Trump, Bush himself has been rehabilitated. So Americans did forget after all. Today, when Iraq is talked about, if at all, it is talked about as a thing that happened. Even on the good side, the anti-war side, I often hear in this country what we did to Iraq. While this we could be heard as people taking responsibility for the actions of their government, I have often felt that it also carries entitlement, a certain form of narcissism. What I hear is, We are the center of your story. Iraqis are the backdrop of the American story, the American soldier trauma story. I do sometimes think about the fact that more than 2 million Americans have set a foot in the land of the two rivers, one of the biggest military deployments in recent history, and I often wonder if their homes still carry traces of our world, small specks of Iraqi dust. Dust can travel, it does not know borders. Iraq is a buzzword to talk about US foreign policy, namely the US. Iraqis, our social movement, our feminist movement, our everyday life, us as people, evaporate in a political standpoint that is more interested in staying the center of the story. We have seen this a lot, even in the so-called progressive spaces where Palestinians, Arabs are not to be trusted to talk about what is happening to them, about resistance, to explain what this means, what it does, even as more than 2 million Palestinians are being bombed and starved, as the American-Israeli genocidal violence is happening live in front of the world. Even then, the Israeli, the white Jewish intellectual, is still given precedence, is still mostly trusted. It is still the white European story that it is told as the premise of all of this. Trying to change. In the past 5 years, I have worked on an initiative called Critical Studies of Iraq, with a network of feminist activists and scholars, sociologists and anthropologists in Iraq. We have been thinking of what it means to take Iraq as a framework and not as a case study, to theorize from and not only about. In the hegemonic global academy, feminist questions such as what theory is for, whose interest does it serve, are rarely invoked. Iraq has been theorized from outside of its borders, from the metropolitan centers that have played a central role in destroying the very possibility, political, structural, and infrastructural, of the very existence of a free and functioning Iraqi academic and intellectual life. Through the Critical Studies of Iraq initiative, we are reflecting on what an Iraqi research agenda would look like if we were to decide what we want to theorize about and how we want to go about it. We insist on the fact that Iraq, its social movement, its people, are sites of knowledge making and theorization, not third world fieldwork, informing first world questions. The global movement against the genocide in Gaza broke many political and epistemological barriers in centering Gazans and Palestinians and their own analysis of what was happening to them and to the world. Palestinians have resisted being reduced to objects of spectacle, insisting on their agency as narrators, witnesses, and analysts, in pointing out that Palestine is a framework through which the world can be understood and changed. This movement threatened the status quo. The repression faced by its actors, from the arrest of protesters in the streets, in the encampments, its influencers, intellectuals, and artists, reveal how much it touched the heart of the systems of power that structure the contemporary world. The system felt threatened. The movement, although diverse, opened political and epistemic horizons of transnational solidarity. In the ranks of street protests all over the world, people made the connection with the genocidal violence in Sudan, for example. Away from a form of depoliticizing whataboutism, for many, Palestine provided a framework of engagement with the political situation in the region and in the world. Not only the West was denounced for its full responsibility, but also the Arab regimes that repressed any attempt by its citizens to show solidarity with Palestinians. The gap between people and their rulers could not be clearer. The global movement against the genocide also revealed geographies of repression and victimhood. Who gets to be seen as victims, as people? What type of violence and oppression is legible? What kind of violence is not? Who gets to be in solidarity and experience the thrill of a movement? Who mourn in silence? How do politics of solidarity and allyship both contest and reproduce systems of power? Palestine is a lens that opens our political and theoretical horizon. It is not where our political imaginary ends, of course. I'm interested in developing theoretical interventions that make people in Palestine, Iraq, Sudan, Iran, and beyond matter not only in death and as victims, but as living and as people developing frameworks to make sense of the systems of power that structure our world. I would like to interrogate US-centric scholarship, archetypal anti-imperialism, and articulate an analysis of empire that allows a holistic practice of solidarity. An analysis that makes violence in its different forms legible, that makes space for fields of struggle that engage with multiple systems of power and scattered hegemonies. I would like to develop a theoretical imagination that emancipates itself from the frame imposed by US Zionist violence. An imagination wide, rich, and beautiful, in contrast with the narrowness, poverty, and ugliness of imperial cruelty that allows us to mobilize across national borders and beyond political correctness. To do this, I engage with transnational feminist thinking and organizing. The insistence on the trans in the term transnational is, of course, a refusal of this kind of classical international that essentializes and homogenizes categories such as nation and women. It means to refuse the capitalist, white, middle-class woman of the world. Trans also means transcending borders of nation, gender, and sexuality. There is an urgent necessity to connect the dots, to make the connections between spaces, places, people, to break with this idea of a here and a far away there that structure the mind of most people, actually. To insist on the fact that we live in one world, structured by systems of power, racial, colonial, heteropatriarchal, capitalist, that some, mostly but not strictly, in the global north benefit from these systems, and some are victims of it, oppressed by it. It means that some live at the expense of others through their exploitation, through their oppression. It means too that Gaza, Palestine, Iraq, Afghanistan, just like Vietnam, are present in the everyday lives of people in the US, in its military-industrial complex, in its normalization of police violence, in its anti-Black and anti-immigration racism, and in its neo-colonial white feminism, and so many other aspects of its social, economic, and political life. All the important debates about racial reckoning have to be articulated with imperial reckoning. Transnational feminist thinking should allow us to develop a serious analysis on the relationship between racism, imperialism, and settler colonialism. It implies the necessity to decenter US narrative and center instead the subjectivities, the experiences, the trajectories of those on the other side of the empire, on the receiving end of these systems of power. It implies understanding empire as structure, not simply as the agency of a criminal nation state or a political actor. Within feminist thinking, it also means the necessity to interrogate the subject of feminism. It implies thinking seriously about what gender and what violence mean, specifically when thinking through Iraq and Palestine, when we know that Iraqi men, Palestinian men, are not considered civilians, humans. The white colonial militaristic framework of depicting our men as perpetrators of violence by default is still hegemonic. During the invasion occupation, the US invasion occupation, Iraqi men were considered by the US Army as fighters by default. But in Iraq, at least, there was the women and children narrative still at play. In Gaza, where most of the victims are women and children, we see that even the very problematic category that has been critiqued a lot by feminists, the women and children category, but even this category does not even stand. So I believe that what we are witnessing is a continuation and intensification of dynamics put in place through the war on terror. I'm interested in looking at the real continuities and the real ruptures. I think that a lot of people see what is happening as exceptional. What I want to show is that it is exceptional only for some, that it is the continuation and intensification of a process already at play. The perceived distribution of the normal and the exceptional does not only follow national, racial, gendered, and class lines, but it essentially relies on which side of the US empire one stands. Let me take us back to 2003. What is commonly called the Iraq War was in reality an invasion and occupation based on lies about weapons of mass destruction. It toppled the Ba'ath regime dictatorship, but after arming it in the 1980s during its war with Iran. And in fact, I think it's important to recall that the US supported the Ba'ath regime ascension to power through a coup that put an end to the progressive revolutionary regime that established the first Iraqi republic in 1958, just like it did in many other contexts, such as in Latin America. In the 1990s, the US imposed, through the UN, some of the harshest sanctions ever imposed on a country. Its victims were mostly women and children. The sanctions of the 1990s actually had a lot in common with the Israeli blockade on Gaza. There is something to say about infrastructural violence, and I will talk about it later. So in 2003, the occupying forces put in power a political elite that came from abroad and established an ethno-sectarian political system, a regime of segregation and separation, breaking with equal citizenship and shaping political representation through ethnic and religious lines. This really played a central role in the sectarian war and waves of militarization that we saw since 2003, and that saw the rise of sectarian armed groups such as ISIS. Since then, everything that sustains life in Iraq has been privatized, as the state and its institutions have entirely collapsed. The Iraqi regime systematically attacked democratic forces such as women and human rights groups and social movements. It has brutally repressed the massive uprising of October 2019 that demanded the fall of the post-2003 political class, wealth redistribution, freedom and justice for victims of the regime's brutal rule. An elite that is mostly allied to Iran, that has dismantled social protections and public services and deprived poor, working class people and women of essential resources and rights. Opposition human rights activists, journalists, writers, intellectuals, feminists, and protesters are regularly attacked through misogynistic and masculinistic anti-gender campaign and free speech legislation framed as a war on terror. Sounds familiar, right? So the continuities and ruptures follow very different lines than those perceived by many in the US today. There are continuities in the rise of fascism on one side of the empire, while it has facilitated brutal authoritarian takeovers on the other side. In the attacks on women and gender, when it has brought to power masculinist forces in Iraq and supported the mass killing of women and children in Gaza. In its gutting of social protection, public services, and healthcare, when it has brutally imposed privatization and free market authoritarianism everywhere it could, in the ugliest face of its white supremacist ideology, when it has imposed ethno-nationalism in Iraq. These are continuities founded on genocide and slavery. For those of us thinking about decoloniality and accustomed to a transnational framework, there is no domestic or foreign policy. Rather, there are people situated differently within the systems of power, racial, heteropatriarchal, capitalist, that structure our world. The trends in transnational perspective invite us to break with binary thinking, such as the here and the there, that structure our hegemonic understanding of the world, and the distribution of what is normal and what is exceptional. Let me take us to Iraq now. To a series of intifadat, uprisings, that started more than a decade ago. Despite an incredibly violent political establishment, protests grew throughout the country, particularly in the south, in Basra, a province from which most of Iraq's oil is extracted, and that is ruled by brutal armed groups. Slogans became more radical with time, demanding the fall of the entire political class. And then, Nrid Watan, we want a country, became the slogan of the 2019 uprising that expressed really the desire for a life worth living with functioning infrastructure, a future for a population mostly young, the end of the brutality of the political class, and the rejection of the sectarian system put in place by the US occupying forces in 2003. And also the rejection of both Iran and US grip on the country. It was the biggest, it has been the biggest protest movement in the country since the formation of the modern state. It was led by the poorest of the poor neighborhoods, the poor regions of the South, and very young people. As people massively took to the streets in Baghdad, Tahrir Square, and in Iraq's main southern cities, they faced immense violence. The Iraqi security forces and armed groups affiliated with the political establishment and Iran shot at protesters, killing hundreds in the first 2 weeks only. The brutality of the repression pushed more Iraqis onto the street with rage and with courage. A wide spectrum of the population joined as protests grew into neighborhoods, schools, and universities. The middle class, state employees, students, workers' unions, army soldiers, and organized advocacy groups such as human rights and women's groups all joined. Similar protests were happening in the main cities of the south, in Basra and Nasriya and Najaf, Karbala for the first 2 months. A general strike was followed all over the country. In Baghdad, for about 6 months, protesters occupied Tahrir Square and its surroundings, setting up hundreds of tents in which they lived, cooked, cleaned, gathered to debate politics as much as football, worked on constitutional amendments and smoked shishas, stood with banners demanding to appoint a new prime minister, and stood dancing and singing. Protesters opened a theater, a cinema, and in particular small libraries at every corner of the square. They opened medical units and ran educational workshops. They covered the walls with colorful murals, drawings, and tags. Among the ranks of the 2019 uprising, or Thawrat Tashrin we call it, women who did not belong to any formal group started organizing. A new generation of activists speaking a different language than the one of the established organizations became more visible. While some partially relied on the legacy of the established groups, many broke with it, articulating a discourse that speaks to women's everyday life and to women as oppressed individuals with repressed desires, dreams, and aspirations. They spoke a frank language about feminicides, about sexual and gender violence, emancipated from NGOized framing. Protesters put forward what I call their own politics of life and death in the streets, mobilizing as people and bodies, as infrastructures, and negotiating a new social order that centers the marginalized. In the past 2 decades, feminists in Iraq have organized and sustained their work against all odds. They have been in an impossible situation, fighting to preserve the very limited and imperfect spaces and frames of rights and freedom that are left in a context of state and economic collapse, generalized violence, and the extreme politicization of every aspect of their life and scrutiny over their choices. So far, both the Iraqi security services and the various armed groups, many of which are aligned to the Iranian regime, continue to rule, kill, torture, kidnap protesters, activists, and intellectuals with full impunity. In the past few years, the Iraqi establishment ran brutal media campaign and fundamental legal reforms that enshrine gender violence. The word gender actually in Iraq is now officially banned in the country. Iraq has adopted some of the most brutal anti-homosexuality laws in the world. And the Ja'fari law, voted a year ago, questioned the very basis of women's legal rights. All of this is done under the pretense, in the name of a so-called anti-imperialism and anti-Zionism. Unfortunately, this is the language of repression in Iraq. A climate of fear and despair has taken over. A generation of people who put all their hopes in the uprising in Thawrat Tashrin. Many activists live in hiding. Others, left the country. Everyone knows that the killers, those who paid them, those who cheered for them, will continue to enjoy full impunity. And Yanar Muhammad actually was shot dead on the morning of March 2nd in front of her home in Baghdad. She was one of the figure of the feminist movement in Iraq. In my previous work, I look at both Iraqi women and feminist discourses and organizing and the everyday material and spatial context in which they live and mobilize. And I propose, to go beyond right-based discourses and to ground feminist experiences in their social, political, and historical context. Through an in-depth ethnography of women's groups since the US invasion and a detailed social and oral history of their personal and political trajectories, I show how women have carried the entire society's survival on their shoulders since the sanctions. Women have maintained and sustained life and acted as substitutes for states' infrastructure's collapse, taking care of family members, the household, the everyday survival in times when men were absent or broken by war. I have shown that in Iraq, women are infrastructures. Thinking through the uprisings and the everyday, we see how violence penetrates every aspect of life. Forces, what I call forces of death in Iraq today, are very much infrastructural. The collapse of the healthcare system, the destruction and damage to bridges, electricity and water plants, sewage system during the US military intervention in Iraq from the 90s to 2003, all of this still structure the everyday life of Iraqis. The political elites the US put in place privatize oil revenues for their own network of clients. Business and finance happen through bribes and transactions with armed groups and political leaders. There is not a week in Iraq where people do not take to the street to protest. Farmers for access to water and the rebuilding of water infrastructure is vital to their work. Entire neighborhoods take to the street to demand water and electricity during the debilitating heat waves of Iraqi summers, especially in the southern provinces. People demand justice for intellectuals, activists, and protesters killed by the security forces and armed groups. Iraq truly has been made entirely dependent on its oil, on the petrodollar system to be more precise. Its economy's survival relies on it and on the US Federal Reserve dispensing of a dollar cash flow. This has been achieved through US interventions that have stripped the country of its sovereignty over the past decades. The Iraqi political establishment's alignment to Iran does not change that. Iran's regional influence works to suppress Iraqi's political freedom, keep the elite's brutal grip on the society, not allowing it to breathe, to live freely. The post-2003 Iraqi regime has maintained Saddam's brutality, or maybe become a caricature of it. Iran's influence keeps the systems dysfunctional. It does not allow any political horizon that does not serve its economic, political, ideological, and geopolitical interests. Iraq's complete loss of sovereignty means that it does not have any form of control over the management of vital resources. It cannot pressure Turkey, for example, to open a dam that has caused the Tigris River to run dry. It has no choice but to rely on Iran for its gas and electricity. It is in the complete mercy of the oil corporation in its own oil field, whether Chinese, Russian, Japanese, or British. In other words, Iraqis are made disposable by a world system that extracts every force of life, every resource, and leaves people to their own survival. Iraqis are accustomed to relying on themselves to maintain and sustain life. Crisis is the norm. The exceptional is the everyday. The rise of Arab oil has shaped and reshaped US military imperialism. The global military oil capitalist complex is tied to post-colonial state building and empire. In Iraq, it has meant the complete annihilation of sovereignty and the brutalization of its society for decades. What is trivialized as a proxy war, referring to the US-Iran confrontation on Iraqi soil, has in reality meant the destruction of economic and political futures that could benefit Iraqis. One of the main slogans of Thawrat Tashrin was, I said Nrid Watan, but another one was Nrid Naish, we want to live. It expressed a demand for functioning infrastructures and services that sustain a decent life Also, it expresses suffocation from a regime that prevents the most basic individual freedoms, especially for women, and brutalize activists, intellectuals, and protesters. So I think that understanding empire as structure, as opposed to the actions of criminal nation states, and women as infrastructure, can help us make sense of the current moment. In the age of the climate catastrophe, the intensification of military interventions for the seizing of resources has turned war into infrastructural wars. In Iraq, in Gaza, the wars on people are also infrastructural wars. The destruction of everything and everyone that makes life, its reproduction, its continuation possible, including women and children. In Iraq and in Palestine, the clarity of racial capitalist monstrous brutality is as clear as the impunity it enjoys. It is destroying our futures. It is very significant that all the protests in Iraq started in Basra, and this is a picture of the Iraqi marches. The province from which most of Iraqi oil is extracted, and that totally lacks infrastructures. Basra is one of the hottest points on earth in the months of July, with very limited state-sponsored electricity and where the water and sewage systems are dysfunctional. Some reports show that because of these high temperatures, part of the country will be unlivable, including Baghdad, will be unlivable for humans in the next 30 years. In the recent period, there is more and more scholarship that pushes us to think of time and space differently, and to look at recorded and deep human history, right? That there's all this literature that talks about the Anthropocene and looking at time, human history from the invention of agriculture. And I think it's very relevant to reflect on the fact that the protesters of Thawrat Tashrin, of the October 2019 uprising, are mostly from the region of the Fertile Crescent. Many are from the marches, where some people have sustained practices of fishing and cultivating that originate in Sumerian times. So people have lived and flourished on these lands for thousands of years, way before the rise of extractivist capitalist modernity. Centering the subjectivities of these people, of those whose lives are disposable, so easily erased, demand a political imagination that goes beyond the middle class global north approach of climate justice or climate change. It means that before we provincialize the human, which is something that is suggested in the age of the Anthropocene, we take into account how gendered, racial, extractivist capitalism has particularly impacted the lives of some, whose precariousness need to be at the center of our political imagination. And I'll go back with a picture of Thawrat Tashrin in the city of Basra, actually, to end with a note on what I call, or what I hope will be, uncolonial futures. In focusing on uprisings, on intifadat, in times of disasters and apocalyptic violence, and in taking us from Iraq to the US and back through Gaza, I hope I managed to show the importance to break with the here and the there that structure common understanding of the world. I emphasize on the importance to understand empire as structure, hoping that it can provide a framework to think of Iraq, Palestine, and also Sudan. I think there is so much more to say about how regional forces how they have their own structures of power invested in projects of racial extractivism and dispossession in the most violent way possible. I also want to think of the ways in which Arab centrism has often erased Kurdish and non-Arab resistances. Fascisms in our context are part of this structure, but they also carry their own logic, their own structures. We need to do justice to the multiple dynamics at play, being able to articulate and hold several levels of critique simultaneously. We need to be able to compare without equating. I want to think of a world where we are all truly connected and in which the integrity of the body, its freedom, its dignity, and the possibility to live a dignified life with all the structural and infrastructural dimensions that it requires are at the center of our political and theoretical imagination. This means trying to connect the intimate, the personal, the political, the structural, all together. It means doing justice to the multiple dynamics at play, once again. It is absolutely essential for us, and I speak as a feminist, to build transnational spaces where we can collectively imagine the world we want to live in, not only the one that we are standing against. What I would call the global feminist intifada that I imagine goes beyond a double critique. It centers the political and theoretical imagination toward the subjectivities, experiences, and lives of people who are on the receiving end of the brutal systems of power that structure our world. Rather than limiting ourselves to a critique, it's about doing justice to the multiple forms of violence that they are facing. I want to end where I started by saying that I always go back as a feminist to what has shaped my understanding of the world, that the personal is political. And I tend to stay away from analyses that are from above, that pretend to be predictive, and that are supposed to explain everything. I leave this kind of an analysis to the white men and the so-called experts that blossom in times of incommensurable violence. We need to think about what it means to write and to build movements as spectators of violence. We need to think about our positionalities and the ethical and political dimensions of doing this work. We are accountable to the people about whom we write. I call this political and epistemological commitment uncolonial, the refusal to center the logic of those who commit violence and create the condition for it, to convince them of our humanity, the insistence to break with their categories of victimhood, and instead the importance in centering the subjectivities, the experiences, and the lives of those, as I said, situated on the receiving end of these systems of power. And also that makes them matter not only in death and as victims, but as living and as people developing frameworks to make sense of the world. This should allow us to account for all the violence beyond political correctness and forms of resistance that are not defined by the oppressor's logic. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Professor Ali, for such an insightful and such a you've pulled together a lot of important and profound strands that it will take me, and I believe it will take many of our audience also some time to digest and to comprehend. Exceptionally important and exceptionally insightful. So thank you, and I commend you for this. We have 15 minutes for questions and comments from our audience. Please drop your question in the chat box and we will read it out loud. I will start with, I don't wanna turn this into, it could easily turn into just a conversation where I am indulging in asking you and seeking from your wisdom and from your knowledge, Professor Ali. So I don't want to turn it into such, but I want to take the opportunity and ask you a question on how your conversation showed us eloquently kind of the continuation of the sufferings of the violence and the legacies of the empire and some of the power hierarchies and power inequalities in the framework that we are accustomed to use to understand the world and to understand politics and to understand gender relations and racial relations and inequalities around us. But I also want to invite you to walk us through your title, especially your use of the term apocalypse. It's a term that is tricky to pronounce, and it's very profound. and at least I think the way that I think about it, that it suggests it invokes almost like a dual meaning, a meaning of the
Mhm,
that an era is coming to a finality, but also that there is something that is being reborn, and whether the something that is being reborn, whether
mhm, mhm.
it's scary or whether it is hopeful. So I would really like to hear more from you about how to understand these times within the framework of an apocalypse.
Yeah, and thank you so much, Nermin, for the question. And perhaps I should have, you know, talked more about the title. I mean, the thing is, why did I use it? I mean, the term apocalypse actually is not necessary. There's no really equivalent in Arabic. We talk about Nakba in Arabic, like the catastrophe, actually, whether in Iraq, whether in Palestine, actually, mostly in Palestine, and Nakba and is used to talk about 1948 and also to talk about what's happening in Gaza. And people talk about an ongoing Nakba, right? So if the title was in Arabic, I would have called it انتفاضات والنكبة, right? Or في ظل النكبة, right? So the uprisings and the Nakba or the catastrophe. I use apocalypse because I feel that um, people, especially I think in on the bright side of the empire, uh, talk about the apocalypse as if it's something that um, they're afraid of. It might come, it might happen. And what I like to say that it has happened, it is happening. It has happened in Iraq, it has happened in Gaza, in Sudan, in Congo, in many contexts. It has happened, and it's happening geographically away from people still feeling that it's ahead of them, not being aware that we live in one world, and that if it's happening there, it's connected to it actually not having happened here. Is also like, it's almost as much as the term express the exceptional, is almost to say, to de-exceptionalize it and to say that it has happened. And there's a continuation of a process of violence that brought from the war on terror, and of course from colonial times, apocalypse over and over again in certain contexts. And I think also something that I would um, that I should have actually mentioned is my attachment to the term intifada, or to uprisings, and to also look at these times of fascism and genocides through the lens of uprising, to also avoid this kind of doomsday. Uh, um, uh, uh, like, I feel like all the movies, there's so much literature on apocalyptic literature nowadays that have this kind of doomsday, everything, once again, that exceptionalize the apocalypse and also take us to the no hope. And for me, looking at this time through the lens of uprisings that were initiated by people who have been through these apocalypse, such as people in Iraq, and especially because in Iraq, the people who rose against the post-2003 regime have been the poorest of the poor. Like, it's not a middle class uprising, it's really an uprising and series of uprising that really were initiated by people who have been brutalized in the past few decades, economically, politically, and who are facing immense violence. So I try to kind of think about the moment through this, also to give us hope, to show us that it is possible to mobilize, and also to show us that what has happened actually in Iraq not only is connected to, but somehow there's this phrase that Aimé Césaire used in discourse on colonialism called le choc colonial en retour, or I think in English it's the colonial boomerang. It's that this violence is coming from. Sometimes I imagine it a little even more poetically. I feel that this imperial violence is coming from every crack, every bullet hole, and coming back to haunt the empire. And I think it's not it's being realistic to say that, showing that there are so much. So, for example, the language of the white supremacist forces, fascist forces that are ruling this country. I mean, the language, the anti-gender campaign, the like the misogyny, the sexism, the sexual violence, all of this, along with racial supremacy, white supremacy. I mean, somehow this is something that they actually brought to Iraq in 2003. That has become the Iraqi system since 2003, and now it's coming back here in the heart of the empire. So I'm trying to think through these connections, but again, I'm trying to think through these connections without necessarily equating. Right? I compare. I look, I connect the dots, and I think that what transnational feminist thinking is very good at doing is connecting the dots without equating.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for such a thoughtful and such a informed and eloquent and well put response, Professor Ali. We have a question from Professor Alexandra Sigerman. Of course, she's thanking you for your wonderful lecture, and she is inviting you to comment on the role of media shifts over the last 25 years. From network television and newspapers to YouTube and social media, and how it has shaped both imperial structures but also feminist infrastructures. Really love the question, and I think
Thank you, Alex. Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
as those who do work in feminism, I think we look at these spaces as both spaces of maybe hope, but also spaces of threats and fears and disappointments. But I'll
Valiance.
let you expand on it for Professor Sigerman.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Nermin, you'll have a lot to say about that too, in relation to Egypt and the uprising in Egypt. You know, I mean, it is now clear. I mean, we know there's research that show that actually what circulates the most on social media is actually right-wing fake news. That's what circulates the most. Like, so we know how much it is crucial. What has been brought to us as this dissemination of information, this connection between people, this kind of freedom to communicate with each other across borders, has in fact reinforced right-wing forces all over the world, and is part, I think, of these structures of empire. However, it has also been used by protesters. I mean, in Iraq, definitely it has been used by protesters, by feminists, and actually the new generation of feminists that I talk about that came out of Thawrat Tishrin, or the October 2019 uprising, is very much online. Is very much online because and has actually managed to use the online tool in a way that counters surveillance. I mean, a lot of figures of activism don't do like the most established groups do, which is to publish statements. That's what Yanar used to do under their name, etc. The new generation tend to write in pen name. And also, there's a lot of accounts that are collective accounts where you don't know actually who is speaking. It's the name of the movement, and I think that feminist slogans, I mean, circulate much more quickly. There's certain ideas that circulate more quickly, and there is really an effectiveness to when we think of feminicides, when we think of cases of sexual violence, of taking to the social media to provoke a reaction and to actually influence people thinking. And so I think it's in both. When you know how to navigate the surveillance regime, and when you know how to use it in a way to navigate these regimes, you can actually make it work. But it is, I do think that it is nowadays, and we think about it all the time, also even as faculty, as everyday people, how these new ways of communicating are putting us on the spot, and putting our names on the spot, recordings of talks and lectures, and we try to develop strategies to protect ourselves, but somehow I think that it is escaping us.
Yeah, absolutely. Very well put. Um, I wanna ask you, there's something so profound that you mentioned during the talk, and it does also connect to, I think, those moments where in your personal careers or in academic personal career, it has been difficult to, move on and go on and produce and be productive. You talked about how the crisis is becoming the norm.
Yeah.
We live in a world where we're always on the brink, of something, and that something is not good. And peace is becoming the exception. What frameworks do we need to understand that and to live with it, and hopefully to challenge it?
Yeah, actually, I mean, the whole framework that I'm trying to develop, that I call uncolonial, kind of as opposed to decolonial. Although, I mean, I engage with decolonial thinking, but I'm trying to think beyond it, because what I feel is that we are saturated, all of us. We are saturated with these shocking images, shocking discourses, shocking narratives. Also because I feel like media networks and how social media work is to saturate us with this amount of information, and many of us become also sometimes numb, right? Numb to like this saturation of, and I feel also the repetition of the right-wing discourse, like what media networks, even leftist media networks, do is, for example, to comment on Trump said this today, whatever. This is so shocking, and then we get into we amplify actually in our personal life these right-wing white supremacist narrative, in being always answering them. And what I propose, and that's kind of where I move to uncolonial, is instead of always answering, the logic of the empire, instead of always, because if you answer, you have to also incorporate it. It has to be present in your mind. Being uncolonial is to actually move away from it. And when we communicate, when we talk, what we share is actually other ways of living, alternative to these white supremacist, imperial, racial, extractivist, incredibly violent political system that we live in.
Oh. Thank you so much again, Professor Ali, for such a thoughtful talk, and for such an incredibly informative conversation. And I also want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank you for your questions. I want to thank you for your presence, and as always, your energy that makes these events meaningful. We will
Thank
be
you so much.
continuing this series and our spotlight lectures in the fall. I hope that you will join us, and I hope that you will keep bringing your curiosity and your voice into the room. On behalf of the Women's and Gender Studies program, thank you again, Professor Ali, and thank you,
Thank
everyone.
you so much, Narmin. Thank you very much. Have a beautiful day.
You too. Thank you. Bye for now.
Bye. Ma salama.
Recording stopped.